Hi everyone, I'm David Hamilton. I'm the Kindness Tsar for Psychologies magazine, and today I want to talk about mindfulness and kindfulness. Now you've heard of mindfulness, haven't you? I mean, most people now have heard of mindfulness. You know, the idea that, you know, the meditative practice where you really start by being mindful of the fact that you're breathing, or mindful of something. You might be mindful of even the state, the condition of your body. But kindfulness is like mindfulness, but while you're breathing or noticing that you're breathing, you can introduce a sentiment of kindness, of kindness, love, compassion, affection, emotional warmth to someone. And what's interesting is there's a number of different ways that mindfulness and kindfulness affect us, and they affect us in similar, but in some cases quite startlingly different ways. I mean, one of the first things that happens with mindfulness type practices is that they impact the actual physical structure of the brain. I mean, for example, when you breathe, you breathe and you notice that you're breathing. Essentially what you're doing is you're taking the noticing part of the brain to the gym. Like if I went to the gym and I worked out, let's say, a muscle, then two things would happen. The muscle would become firmer and it would become stronger. Now, when you work out a region of the brain, something kind of similar happens. That region of the brain also becomes, thicker, firmer and thicker and stronger, ultimately more powerful. Neuroscientists don't call it muscle growth, of course they call it neuroplasticity, but the idea is similar, that and essentially if you work out a region of the brain, it becomes more powerful. Now, when you practice mindfulness, so you notice that you're breathing, the region of the brain you take to the gym is the noticing part of the brain, which is this part here above your eyes, also known as the prefrontal cortex. And essentially that part of the brain becomes firmer and it becomes larger, it becomes ultimately more powerful. And looking at it, you've actually changed the physical structure of your brain. Similarly to the way that you increase muscle fibers when you work out a muscle, so you increase neural fibers when you work out a region of the brain. So that part of the brain ends up with more connections, and ultimately it's like moving it from dial-up internet to broadband internet, ultimately fiber optic. It becomes more connected, more wired, and ultimately more powerful. So you really work out a part of the brain. But what about kindfulness? Well, kindfulness, it so happens that when you introduce to your mindfulness practice a sentiment of emotional warmth, of love, affection, warmth, compassion, empathy, kindness regarding a person or even an animal, then you selectively take the left-hand side of that frontal part of the brain to the gym. I mean, you take the whole area to the gym, but there's a slight bias to the left-hand side. It's like going to the gym and working out slightly more on one side than the other, so that one side gets slightly more muscle fibers than the other. Now, it turns out when that happens in the brain, then that region of the brain is more associated with the experience of positive emotion and happiness and joy. In other words, what it ultimately does, by making that area, the left-hand side, more powerful, it makes it slightly easier to access states like happiness and joy. These sorts of things. Whereas overall mindfulness, working at the whole region, helps us, that the whole region is more associated with the ability to be in control of yourself, self-control, the ability to override knee-jerk emotional reactions to things. So there's different, so therefore you become better at, if you work out that muscle, you become better at that. Just like if I worked at any muscle, you become better, that muscle becomes stronger, so therefore you become better at doing all the things that you do with that muscle. So if you work out the whole region with mindfulness, you become better able to control yourself, better able to manage your state. But if you practice more kindfulness, you become better able to access states like happiness and joy and emotional warmth and compassion. So they're very similar, but ever so slightly different in that respect. And in a sense, you can understand why, because one process is mostly passive, mindfulness, whereas the other type of meditation is more active. And what I mean by that is, typically with mindfulness, when I say passive, you're not really trying to do anything with your mind, because the simplest form of it is just to notice that you're breathing. So I'm not really doing anything with my mind. I'm not trying to imagine anything or calculate something or think something. I'm just noticing that I'm breathing. So it's a largely passive kind of process. But with kindfulness, one of the main kindfulness practices is the Tibetan Buddhist metta, or loving kindness, where you think of people and you, in a sense, you generate a sentiment of kindness and compassion. So you say things like, may you be happy, may you be well, may you be safe, may you be at peace. And you roll over these types of sentiments repetitively. And so it's more of an act of you're actively doing something with your mind versus noticing something. I mean, mindfulness can get a bit more technical. It goes a bit deeper. The simplest mindfulness form, as I've said, is just, let's say, counting the breaths. And then it's more of a concentration. So that's why you impact the concentration part of the brain. But, more advanced forms of mindfulness that many of you watching might have practiced, takes it a little bit deeper, and you notice where you're noticing from. So you notice your breathing, but then you'd start to notice, where am I noticing from? Where is my consciousness? Is there a point? Is it like behind my eyes? Is it in my head? If I was to become aware of my tummy, am I becoming aware by sensing down the way? If I think of the top of my head, am I sensing up the way? So therefore we start to find a point that we consider to be the point of consciousness, and then a deeper form of that is just to become aware that you're aware of that. So in other words, not just watching your breath, becoming aware that you're watching your breath, and you track back and back and back to a deeper sense of your own being. And some more advanced forms of mindfulness do that kind of thing, where you start to move from a little bit more passive into a little bit more kind of active. But as you do each different type of practice, you find a different impact in the brain. I mean, incidentally, some mindfulness practices focus a lot on the body. So you do like a body scan, you become aware of the state of the body. Now, brain scans show that impacts a particular region of the brain called, you don't really need to know this unless you're interested, but the somatosensory cortex. In other words, the sensing region of the part of the brain that's active when you're physically sensing and focused a part of the body. That part becomes larger. It becomes more developed, like a muscle. Whereas when you're practicing kindfulness, and it's a sentiment of kindness and compassion, then you impact an area called the insula, which is like an emotional empathy centre of the brain. So there's lots of different ways that the brain is affected with these. But it's not just that. There's physiological effects that you get of different practices. And this is where I feel kindfulness practices really begin to come into their own, and you begin to see some really powerful effects. And when you breathe in, you'll notice that your breath increases, your heart rate increases a little bit, and when you breathe out, your heart rate decreases a little bit. And that difference, broadly speaking, is referred to as heart rate variability. So it's the beat to beat interval between your heart rate, and it reflects a balance between two parts of your nervous system. You have the sympathetic branch when you breathe in, goes into fight or flight, so it speeds your heart rate up, and you breathe out, the parasympathetic comes in, and it begins to go into calm, rest and relax, and the breathing begins to slow down. And a relationship between that gap there is sometimes referred to as vagal tone, and it's like a tone of the calm part of your nervous system. But that vagal tone is really a description of the activity of the vagus nerve. Now, it so happens that the vagus nerve also controls a large anti-inflammatory part of the body. In other words, it's actually called the inflammatory reflex, but the reason I'm explaining this is compassion, kindfulness and compassion-based meditative practices have been shown in scientific studies to increase vagal tone. So let's go back to the muscle analogy. If I was working out a muscle and with that increase in firmness and size, what you observe on the outside is an increase in muscle tone. So what if I was to work out my vagus nerve regularly? Well, what you get is vagal tone. And so it means that if you increase vagal tone, just like if I increase muscle tone and all the things that I use that muscle for become better, if you increase vagal tone, all the things that the vagus nerve is used for become better, a little bit more easier. Now, one of the things that the vagus nerve does, as I said, it controls inflammation. In numerous studies, scientists have found that as we increase our compassion, our sense of compassion, which is what you do in a kindfulness practice, so you get an increase in vagal tone. So it's like you're training your vagus nerve, and just like training a muscle improves muscle tone, we train the vagus nerve and you increase vagal tone. And at the same time, there's also a corresponding drop in inflammation. Scientists measured a big change in the inflammatory response to stress in people who practiced a kindfulness practice. So there's emerging evidence now that there's an anti-inflammatory effect from kindfulness practices. Isn't that absolutely amazing? So mindfulness practices where they can make you feel nice and calm and ultimately also produce a drop in blood pressure. Kindfulness practices, on the other hand, have that additional benefit where they can actually create an anti-inflammatory effect. I think that's absolutely amazing. And think about it. Scientists who study aging have coined a term called inflammaging. So we know what inflammation is. You cut yourself, it becomes red and swollen. That's inflammation, that's a vital part of the immune response. But inflammation is also a major accelerant of aging, and it's one of the underlying causes, if you will, of aging. So any way of controlling inflammation, which a number of companies and researchers are trying to do as a way to slow the aging process, ultimately controlling inflammation can have an age-slowing effect. So scientists call it inflammaging because inflammation plays such a role in the aging process. So as we practice kindfulness, as we increase our kindfulness practices, introducing sentiments of empathy and compassion and emotional warmth, then ultimately what we're doing by having a dampening effect on inflammation is we're kind of slowing the aging process. Now, this was experimentally verified recently, just last year, in a slightly different way. Scientists, led by a professor called Barbara Fredrickson, and also the main meditation teacher, and this is a lady called Sharon Salzberg, who many of you might be familiar with. She teaches metta, loving kindness meditation. She's written a lot of books on that overall kind of practice, all about the sense of compassion and the different effects. And what they did is they compared mindfulness against kindfulness, and they used the loving kindness Tibetan Buddhist meditation for that versus no meditation at all. And they measured aging at the genetic level. Now, one of the ways you can do that is measure the length or the rate of loss of the little end caps on the DNA. You know, in a pair of shoes or a pair of trainers, the little plastic end cap you get, it's called an aglet. And over time, that little aglet gets worn down, doesn't it? For a number of different reasons. But eventually when it gets worn away completely, the shoelace just frays, doesn't it? And you can't even put it through the hole anymore because the aglet's gone. So you ultimately it's like you throw the shoelace away. So something kind of similar happens in your DNA. You have a wee aglet on the top of the DNA. It's not called an aglet, of course. It's got a more cool name. It's called telomere. But the idea is kind of similar. And what happens through the stresses and strains of our life, through our emotional stresses and our physiological stresses through lifestyle, is the aglet gets worn down and down and down. Eventually, when it gets worn away, the cell ultimately dies. So the length of a telomere is a fairly accurate indicator of someone's biological age. And the rate of loss of length of telomeres is very closely associated with how fast a person is aging at that time. So here was a study. Got a group of volunteers. Some of them did no meditation, some of them did mindfulness. It was over a 6-week period, and some others did Kindfulness. So it was the Tibetan Buddhist loving kindness meditation. And everyone had their telomeres measured and the rate of loss of the telomeres. So you had a standard rate of loss in the people who didn't practice any meditation at all. You had a standard drop in telomere length. People who practiced mindfulness, there was a little bit of a drop, not completely as much as no meditation practice at all. So there was definitely a slowing effect from mindfulness. But in that 6-week period, there was no loss in telomeres at all in those who practiced kindfulness. Isn't that amazing? It doesn't mean, obviously, that if you practice kindfulness every day, you'll never age. It didn't mean that at all. It was only a 6-week study, and the sample size wasn't absolutely huge. But what it was showing us is that kindfulness, somehow, there are biological effects of the sentiment of kindness and compassion that seem to have an effect on the aging at the genetic level. Now, one hypothesis, one explanation for this is the anti-inflammatory effect generated by kindfulness practices. Because one way that ultimately our cells age is there becomes a cluttering around the DNA, and what the cluttering does, it's a biological byproduct of kind of aging, wear and tear, and this kind of cluttering effect, it makes it more difficult to read the genes efficiently, so ultimately you get a kind of aging process. It's called the information process of aging. A guy called David Sinclair, professor at Harvard, wrote a book on that called Lifespan. Totally recommend the book. And it might be that kindfulness practices, because they generate an anti-inflammatory effect, it might be that they're cleaning away some of these aging byproducts in the cells. I mean, we don't know for sure, but it's just a hypothesis that it might be cleaning away and therefore keeping the environment around the DNA clean, which also allows the little processes that keep the telomeres healthy. It might also allow them to work more optimally. I mean, nobody knows for sure, that it's still in an early phase. I really just wanted to point out that kind of research. It's absolutely astonishing how that works. I love that science is now probing this. I mean, 20 years ago, science of the mind-body connection was all about stress, look at different effects of stress. And then we started to go into meditation and mindfulness and realise that different states can have different effects. And then eventually we moved into positive emotions and charting some of the effects of those. And I love now that we're looking at kindness and compassion and measuring some really profound, really, really powerful physiological effects, some of them right down to the genetic level. So there you go, mindfulness versus kindfulness. So mindfulness affects the brain in different ways. You work out the whole frontal region of the brain, makes you better able to control yourself, better able to concentrate ultimately. Great if you're if you need to concentrate a lot, then practice mindfulness. Count your breaths, do like 20 or 30 or 40 breaths. Just count from the moment you start breathing, the whole cycle of breath right till the breath ends. Count the whole, just go 1, 2, and count the whole thing. Keep your attention on it and then keep counting. Try go for 10 or go for 20 or 30 or more. And it's fantastic for improving your ability to concentrate because you work out the whole prefrontal cortex. But instead, if you introduce a sentiment of compassion or kindness, thinking about people you care about, and all the reasons why you care about these people in your life, you slightly bias the working out to the left-hand side, and it makes it easier to feel emotional warmth and compassion and empathy. So it depends what your goal is ultimately. So you impact the brain in different ways depending on what your focus or what your sentiment is. But some of the effects go right down to the, mindfulness can help to reduce blood pressure. Kindfulness can have an anti-inflammatory effect. Kindfulness can also seemingly slow the aging process at the genetic level. So there's loads of different ways. I just thought I'd share some of them with you today. There is a lot more comparisons I could make, but I only have a short time in these Facebook Live kind of sessions. So anyway, that's kind of all for today. I'm David Hamilton. I'm the Kindness Tsar for Psychologies magazine. You can check out my page at any time. I'm David R. Hamilton, PhD. You can also find me on Instagram and my website, drdavidhamilton.com. I've written loads of books, 10, 3 of them particularly on kindness, all the 5 side effects of kindness, the little book of kindness, and why kindness is good for you. So on that note, here's a little thing that I'd recommend you do today, is pause for a few moments at some point today and think of 1, 2 or more people in your life, and just make a little list in your mind of some of the reasons why you really care about these people, really value. Think of some of the things that they might have said or done for you, or how they might have supported you. And just see if you can allow your mind to settle on some of these really nice, lovely aspects of these people. And just pause for a few moments at some point today and do that. And if you enjoy the feeling that you get, and if you notice that it sometimes improves how you relate to people, then try it again tomorrow. And then the next day. And if you keep enjoying it, then keep doing it. So anyway, wherever you are, enjoy the rest of your day and be kind. Bye for now.